Hello, everyone. I am Shereen Boyer, and I am in outside of Akron, Ohio. And I am so glad to be here because this is one of my favorite topics. Um, I have been in finance for over 30 years, and I am a former Republican. I used to say, or I often say, that there was a time when there was a debate between my values, which the Democrats represented, and the economics, which the Republicans represented. But for the last 20, 25 years, the Republicans have really walked away from fiscal responsibility. And so in many ways, it made it easy for me because it aligned my values with the kind of rational economics.
So I know that there has been a lot of economic news. What are they talking about, and why do they think that, or why do they say, it's not that they think it, why do they say that their plan is the better plan?
Okay, so you probably have been hearing in the news about the debt ceiling and the deficit, which are really two distinct things. The debt ceiling is an arbitrary limit beyond which the federal government can't spend without explicit approval by Congress. Many, myself included, think we should be getting rid of that, because what it really does is it's as if every year Congress debates whether they're going to pay their credit card bill from last year, right? So we've already spent the money. It's kind of like at home, you look at that and you're like, am I going to pay for what I already bought? And so the debt ceiling is an arbitrary thing, but because debt ceiling and deficit sound a lot alike, they get commingled. Now, the deficit, which is how much we owe as a country, is substantial. However, the deficit for 2021, we were at 2.6 trillion with a T. The growing economy in 2022, the deficit came down by 1.4 trillion, by more than 50%. And so there is an argument to be made about spending and taxes, and I'd be happy to explore that more. But the idea of holding the full faith and credit of the United States, or as an individual, your credit rating, hostage about whether you're going to pay last year's bills is absolute craziness. How we address the deficit, whether we should run a deficit and how much it should be, that's a different issue. But I would like to point out that when Clinton left office at the end of '99, we had zero deficit. And we are now sitting at 1.2 trillion dollars in deficit spending.
I know that the ladies who are here on this call want to know, when they're sitting and talking with somebody who is, regurgitating what they have heard on Fox News,
Sure.
What do we say?
Okay.
Because they truly believe this.
That is a great question. So the US consumers, us as individuals, we make up about 70% of the economy for spending. And so you will notice that the Democrats tend to recommend spending when the economy is in a tough downward slide. So if you think back to 2008, 2009, when there was a housing crisis, there was a fiscal crisis, the economy was seizing up and the banks were seizing up, and nobody wanted to spend, the US government stepped in a little bit under Bush, more under Obama, and they stood in for consumers who wouldn't. And they saved us from going into a second Great Depression. So just a fun fact, fourth quarter of '08, the US economy contracted 8.5%, right? So Bush was in office, Obama was elected during that period. A depression, like the Great Depression, is a 10% contraction in the economy. We were very, very close. And people were afraid to spend because they didn't know what was going to come next, right? I'm not gonna buy anything because I might lose my job. My house might be underwater. And so that is when it's appropriate for the government to step in. And if you take a look at what the government did in '09, it really saved all of us. If you think there was pain there, put us in a depression. It happened again during the pandemic. So for the first time in modern history under Trump, we had an expanding economy and an expanding deficit. And what we should usually see is in the good times, the deficit comes down, just like, your rainy day fund for your house. In the good times, you save a little money and put it to the side because you know there will be tougher times. The furnace is going to go, the roof is going to go. But
Right.
under Trump, when he cut taxes, we expanded the deficit while the economy was growing, and that left us vulnerable when the pandemic came, because with businesses shutting down, schools shutting down, hospitals stressed, if you want to have businesses, hospitals, and schools on the other side of the pandemic, the only institution that could step in is the government. And so they rightly spent money then. And now our job is, now that we're coming out of this, to pay it back, to pay it down. And you can see just in 2022, by virtue of the economy reopening, no changes to tax codes, even with the programs that we have, the deficit has more than declined more than 50%. So it's a cycle. It's an understanding that really over the past 20 plus years, both Obama and Biden came in during crisis moments.
Mhm.
And the way you deal with the crisis is you step in where the consumer won't. The key, though, is then, I said Clinton left us with zero deficit. Well, when George W. Bush left office, that was not the case,
Right.
because they gave it all away. We went to war. You could argue that we had to do that, but if you go to war, you have to pay for it.
Mhm.
For the first time in modern history, we didn't as a country pay for the war we fought.
So we have an understanding of, deficit and the debt ceiling and the deficit going down by 50%. But I think that the arguments that we're hearing, well, eggs are $6 for 18. They were $6.29 to be exact when I went to get them over the weekend. So, and grocery store prices are going up and things are getting higher. And so people think, well, it's got to be, people who don't have an understanding about what the deficit is and why we have inflation and all that. Can you kind of, break a little of that down for us as well? Because that's really, this is hurting folks' pockets right now.
It absolutely is, and it's real. So inflation is a little bit trickier. So just to take your egg example, part of it is the pandemic. Part of it was the avian flu, which wiped out a lot of the egg producers. And
Mhm.
so on top of the disruptions from the pandemic, you also happen to have the avian flu.
Mhm.
Inflation is a problem. Eggs and prices will come down. It was only last summer where people were talking about the price of gas. So food and
Right.
gas are highly volatile, and they
Mhm.
shift very quickly. And gas and that rising price of gas were a huge problem until it wasn't. Right. And so much of economics is what time frame you look at that. So if we took a snapshot last summer of the price of gas, it was on every news story. You can reliably know that on the national news right before Memorial Day, they're going to have a thing about the price of gas going up for the summer. And part of that is the economics of changing over to the summer mix.
Mhm.
But that gave way very quickly. And we're seeing the prices of food begin to resolve. It's not done yet. We just went through a global pandemic, which disrupted,
Everything.
crops, farmers, labor,
Mhm.
and it's going to take a little while to get over that. What I will say is the challenge is that we know that when we go to the grocery store or we pay our heating bill, we feel the pain there.
Mhm.
We can't quantify what it would have been had the government not stepped in. And
Right.
instead of supporting businesses, all of those businesses are gone. If instead of supporting hospitals, all of those hospitals are gone. And so because they did the responsible thing and they kept the economy going and they
Mhm.
supported it during the crisis, although there is still pain now, it's far, far less than what it would have been. And it's hard to quantify that, but you can imagine if your local hospital had gone under, if your
Mhm.
local grocery store had gone under,
Mhm.
what your life would be. And so inflation is basically just a simple where there's more money chasing less goods and it drives up the price. And
Mhm.
so during the pandemic, when you had people leaving the workforce, when you had disruptions at our borders in terms of shipping, when you had on top of that the avian flu. The right things weren't in the right place, and people had money because we weren't spending it on travel, we were dining out. And so those dollars chased those fewer goods. You could see it in bicycles in the summer of 21. Everybody wanted a bike. All the bikes were sitting in Southeast Asia. Couldn't find one. If you did, you paid a premium. As the borders are opening up and things are going back to normal, you're seeing inflation come steadily down. So it hit a high last year of about 9.1. We're down to about a little over 6%. Still too high, but it's trending in the right direction. And it's just going to have to work its way through the system.
So now that we are understanding kind of some of the things that are going on out there, why are Democrats the most fiscally responsible?
I love this question. Thank you, Julie. What I like about the Democratic Party and what makes it easy for me to support the democratic economic principles is simply this. You hear the term fiscal conservative. I substitute fiscally responsible. So we can have a conversation about what we want to do and what we want to be as a people and how we want our country to work. But at the same time, we have to have a plan for how we are going to pay for that and sustain it. And the Democrats, and you often hear, oh, they're going to raise my taxes, et cetera. There are things that we value and collectively agree are important. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. If those programs are going to be there, then we have to pay for them. Public education, the military, infrastructure investment. And so the Democrats have been far more responsible over the past 25 years in terms of being honest with the American people, that if we are going to do things, and we can debate what we want to do, but once you decide that you're going to follow a path, you have to have a way to pay for it and sustain it. And I can just give you an example of where the Republicans really went off track. And we're still dealing with those poor policy decisions 20 years later. So may I just give that,
yes, go.
that explanation? So after George W. Bush was elected in 2000, if we say that was a fair election with the hanging chads, we went to war, right? The 9/11 attacks, and we went to war, and we collectively agreed we were going to respond. Every other time in US history, we have either paid for the war in real time by raising taxes, or in the case of the American Revolution, immediately afterwards. In this case, we have a very small percentage of the population that serves in our military. We went to war. We had zero deficit as a country. The 90s were a great economic expansion, and the tax code was reasonable. We went to war. Then the Republicans pushed through a tax cut. So we were spending all this money fighting in Afghanistan, and they pushed through a tax cut. And then on top of that, because he wanted to be reelected, he pushed through a prescription drug benefit. Now, I happen to believe prescription drug benefit is a worthy thing. But a fiscally responsible person would say, you can have that benefit, but we have to pay for that benefit. And the Democrats have been far more diligent and honest about things cost money. We all know that. And if we want those things, we have to pay for them. Likewise, under President Trump, we had an expanding economy. The tax cut was temporary for us individuals. It's going to go away in a couple of years, just after what would have been his 8 years in office. But the corporate tax cut is permanent. And so, we talk a lot about, you hear the Republicans talk a lot about abuses in the welfare system and public funds, but welfare is just really any government benefit that's given out, right? That we decide to do it. And there's a lot of corporate welfare. And so if we think corporations are more important than individuals, and if we decide collectively we think very few people should control most of the wealth, We have built the tax code for that. Great job.
But Shereen, if we don't give them tax cuts, they won't create jobs. Isn't that what we're told?
Well, there's a big difference between the tax rates that we were paying in the 80s, where the
Mhm.
top tax bracket was substantially higher than it is now.
Mhm.
And if you look at, 35 or 38%, right? So no, there still will be jobs created. If
Mhm.
you don't have a healthy economy with a strong middle class, you won't have a healthy economy because we are 70% of the economy.
Right.
So the argument isn't, oh, Elon Musk won't create more jobs for us. The argument is all of the individuals who want to start small businesses in their community won't have the resources to do that. We as
Mhm.
consumers won't have the money to go and spend there. And
Mhm.
so it's a it's a red herring that's dangled over here, and it's based in fear. But in reality, a strong and healthy middle class is the underpinning of a healthy US economy. When
Mhm.
we get super wealth concentration in the very top, a weak or smaller middle class, and a growing underclass, um, that's not a United States economy that's going to serve us going forward.
Mhm.
So no, and again, is paying 10% tax over zero, is that such a burden for the big companies? There's a big difference between a top tax bracket of 70%, which at times it has been, and a top tax bracket of 15 or 20 or 30%.
Mhm.
And so, they conflate it all, but it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. There's no reason Amazon and Exxon shouldn't pay taxes.
Also, the other thing that has been talked about quite a bit in the news is the rates for borrowing money, basically,
Yeah.
and how that's affecting things. My husband and I got really super lucky because we closed in April on our home here. And so we only have a 3% rate on our mortgage.
Good
And
for
I
you.
know that the mortgage rates are humongous, compared to that, they're like double that now. Can you kind of explain how that works a little bit? Because I hear, well, the Fed needs to do something, or they were too slow to do something here and they should have done this and now they're going to do that and it's going to drive the rates up again. And so then I hear on the other side, see, they don't know what they're doing because they're driving the rates up and now you're not going to be able to buy your home.
I want to talk big picture rather than individual.
Mhm.
So we are back to what I would consider normal interest rates.
Mhm.
The idea that interest rates went to zero and stayed at zero for so long, that was born out of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, where so much damage was done to the economy and the financial system. The
Mhm.
Federal Reserve had only one tool to work with, and that was cut interest rates.
Mm.
And so the Federal Reserve used the tool that they had. The federal government added some programs, the old cash flow clunkers, et cetera. But the Federal Reserve did what they could do, okay? And that was cut interest rates to zero. Um, and as a result of that, we could all buy cars and refrigerators, at 0% for 5, 6, 7 years, buy a house at 3%. That period is the exception, not the rule.
Mhm.
5, 6, 7% interest rates is historically totally normal. My first house, I paid more than the current rates. Most people who are a little bit older can think back to their first home purchases, 7, 8, 9. I've even talked to people 12 or 14% interest rates.
Mhm.
And in the 80s, the rates got as high as 18%.
Mhm.
So we are in kind of a normal middling kind of a place.
Okay.
If you bought during this period, then you were very lucky. But the flip side of the 0% interest rates, and this is my objection to the way the Republicans have handled the country financially.
Mhm.
By throwing us into a financial crisis that, had the Federal Reserve and the government not spent and acted, could have devastated us and put us into a second Great Depression, left the Federal Reserve with very few options but to cut interest rates to zero.
Gotcha.
And You could debate whether or not the Fed should have begun to raise them sooner. I personally think they could have raised them a little bit sooner. However, never before in our history had we had a period where interest rates were at that rate for that long. And so they really were creating policy with absolutely nothing going before that they could draw on in terms of how the economy would respond. So I can appreciate the desire to be cautious about undoing that. However, well, people who were borrowing money benefited from the low interest rates. People who were living on fixed income, people who had maybe a CD or two at the bank and they were living on that interest rate have been getting close to 0% for the nearly 15 years.
Right.
And so while consumers, people who are in the younger and buying phase benefited, it came at the cost of older people who were living off of their investments, who had worked and thought that they could just live off of the interest from their investments. And so there is no free lunch. There's no way I can take something for myself without it coming, right? Because we're all interconnected. And so I go back to the goal ought to be creating a healthy, sustainable economy with fewer crises, particularly self-induced crises.
Right.
Because it's very hard for us as individuals to adapt to that. We're much better off with a steady growing economy than a fantastic period and a devastating period, a fantastic period and a devastating period. It's this very short term, just like the debate with the debt ceiling. It is this brinksmanship, it is irresponsible, and it puts all of us at risk. And so I would say interest rates, we're watching what's happening with inflation. The Fed is probably going to continue to raise rates, albeit a little bit slower, until they see inflation really coming down. The core inflation rate has been a little bit stickier than they would like to see. So we're probably not done with that cycle. If they overshoot and put us into a recession, what happens then is they begin to cut rates and the rates go down. And so they're trying to balance coming out of a pandemic, still riding on the fumes of the interest rates from the financial crisis in 08 and 09. I don't expect them to get it perfectly, but I have to say they've done a pretty good job with some incredibly challenging environments. It would have been far better if under the Trump administration that the deficit had gone down when we were expanding. Had we not done that tax cut, we would have been in a much better shape as a country to have weathered the costs that we had to pay during the pandemic. But that's history. I'm here tonight with all of you because we all want the next election to be different and to keep going in a better way for all of us.
One way that I think that we want to be able to do that is to be able to talk about these things. They don't tell us these things that you have shared with us tonight about how, we need to have things, be paid for, and we need to be able to sustain paying for these things. And when they talk about, I know for sure, at least I think I know this for sure, that when they talk about cutting spending, our biggest expenses are Social Security and
it's the Medicare and Medicaid payments.
Yeah. So those are our biggest expenses. So if I don't know what they
and Republicans don't want to cut them because the voters will
have them.
Have it. So it's a talking point with not much behind it. And so as we look at this, what I would say is the deficit went up under Trump in a period of economic expansion. So who was that good for? It wasn't good for us folks.
Right.
We're not the ones who benefited from that. Sure, if you have a stock portfolio, it went up for those few years. And then along came the pandemic, for which we were ill prepared and it was ill managed. And all of that it got taken away from us. So again, if we want to do this, feast and famine, but there's another saner way where where we don't have to constantly be trying to overcome these crises. And always interesting to me that the voters seem to put Democrats in when the crises come,
Mhm.
right? They seem to know instinctively that, um, gosh, I I don't want to be cut off. If I lose my job, I want to know I'm going to be okay. I don't want
Mhm.
to lose my house. I fear for my elderly parents what's going to happen with their medical care.
Right.
Um, and then we seem to fall for the song and dance when the
Mhm.
crisis is over, and we're mad at them for fixing the crisis. Oh wait, you spent money to fix it? Yeah, yeah, we did.
Several questions in the chat, several comments backing you up. This has been super informative. Everybody wants a transcript, so now I got to figure out how the heck I do that. Anyways, so one of the first questions was, is it true that grocery stores are recording record profits? And I would tack on to Kim's question. Thank you, Kim. What about like corporate price gouging? Because we hear a lot about that. What impact does that have? And is it true about the grocery stores?
Yeah. Some stores are, many of them are not publicly traded, and so don't have to reveal that. But um, a number of grocery stores have got a lot of government support during the pandemic.
Mhm.
I will say that their margins are not terribly high. And so it's hard to say for an individual grocery store what's happening there. I can speak to corporate profits because those are publicly traded companies, and you can see what's happening there. What corporations do is during a crisis, they meet the crisis and then their response doesn't go away. So they shrink their packaging,
Mhm.
and when things resolve, when the supply chain goes back to normal from the pandemic, et cetera, we're still going to be getting, 1.5 less ounces in our cereal and a little bit smaller can. And they did the same thing during the financial crisis in
Yep.
08 and 09.
Mhm.
They lay off people, they do all that. But then it doesn't come around. And I was just thinking of one example. The Trump tax cut, the big thing was they wanted wages to go up for employees, if you can think
Mhm.
back to that.
Mhm.
Very few companies increased wages. Most companies gave a one-time bonus. And so in that 1 year, their workers made more.
Right.
And then from there on out, it all fell to the corporate bottom line. So
Mhm.
there's no doubt that there is some price gouging going on. There's also some very real disruptions to the supply chain, which are absolutely behind some of the prices that we're seeing. The avian flu with eggs, that's absolutely part of it. Um, Disruptions that have been improving, but bringing in produce from overseas during the pandemic was an issue. The ports were overwhelmed. So it's hard to give a definitive answer to that from a grocery store perspective. But from a corporate perspective, there are certainly some that have taken advantage of the moment to set themselves up for a long-term increased profitability.
Next question, was our last true inflation period the early 1970s, even more so than the mid 2000s or 2008 or the pandemic? And if the 1970s were the last true inflation period, then this is the first true inflation that most of us have experienced as adults. So Shereen, do you agree with that? Disagree? What's your comment on that?
I would say the 1970s were the last stagflation, where it went up and they couldn't bring it under control.
Mhm.
I think of the 80s as the last time we really had high inflation. And there were some things that were done to bring it under control. And one of the things that really broke the back of inflation was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because it really changed the sort of economic dynamics from being in a Cold War with two superpowers to being the sole superpower. And so the benefits and the Cold War dividend is really what helped to pull us out of that. It is coming down. If the Federal Reserve is successful, a few years from now, we're going to look back on this and it's going to be a blip on the screen. Much like gas prices in the summer, everybody was horrified at the prices, and now they're down, and it's kind of just a thing that happens. So how successful the government is, and by the way, it's not just the US government that controls it. There are a lot of other factors at play. They have some tools, but this is really a global inflationary problem. And so, yes, for many people, this is the first time they're living through this. And so it can be scary. Um, it does seem that the programs are working. Weirdly, when the Federal Reserve was aggressively raising rates last summer, we typically would expect to see job loss. That wasn't happening, which freed up their hand to be more aggressive. We are now starting to see some companies do some layoffs, particularly in the tech industry. So it is starting to bite a little bit, and we need to see that. The whole point of raising rates is to slow the economy, and slowing the economy slows inflation. And they're just trying to find that balancing point.
One of the things that I was going to say is the beauty of Sweep in our group, Red Wine and Blue in general. We range in ages, I would say, from the 20s all the way up until probably even 80, but for sure the 70s in terms of age. And so there are folks that will be on this call that remember, times of, the 70s, because I mean, I was born in 65, so I remember the 70s. I remember what things were like. I remember the gas crunch in 74 and all of that. The energy crunch when we all had to go school without schools. I mean, they did all kinds of crazy stuff in the 70s that folks who are young adults now don't know anything about. So, and then of course I was a young married adult in the 80s, and had family in the 80s and the 90s and all that. So, I've kind of lived through all of these ones that we have been talking about now, but there are folks on here who haven't, because they, came later. So, I think that this is what the value of what you are sharing with us today is, because this is bridging that history piece of it with what's going on now. So that we have actually a foundation to talk with folks about, because truly, even though what you said about corporate, the corporate economy and what the corporations are doing, while that's hugely, important, most of these people that we will be talking with, and a lot of the folks that will want to argue with us, are really looking no farther than the end of their nose. And so, we need to have that information about talking about the grocery stores. We need to know, about the interests that they thought they were going to be living off of, all of those things, we need to be able to talk about.
Well, I think that's right. And, pocketbook issues,
Yep.
are important to all of us. And I hope that it just gives you some background, but the way we thrive as families is that we want a healthy economy. We want to have, a growing economy. That means job opportunities. Some amount of inflation is normal. None of us love to see the big spikes and declines. It's tough. It is, however, not unusual. And so what I would say is we, under Biden, they prevented us from going into a much worse economic period. Just to put it into perspective, the Ukraine economy, right? The devastated infrastructure, war has contracted 30%. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about getting close to a 10% contraction, that is a really significant contraction. Mm-hmm. And so the government prevented that from happening. And because it was successful, we're focusing on the price of eggs and not losing our homes. The hospitals have collapsed. Mm-hmm. Not just my favorite restaurants have shorter hours, but my favorite restaurants are all gone. Right. Because that's what the alternative could be. And it's tough to argue in the absence of that, but it was very real and a very real possibility.
Next question, and you touched on this a little bit, but it might be helpful maybe to explain to people exactly what this is what's your opinion on trickle down economics? I think you touched a little bit on this already, but maybe just explaining what that even is to people and what you think about it.
The trickle down economics is basically the idea that if you stimulate the very top of the economy, if you help corporations, that corporations will thrive, they'll hire more people hired will earn money, and we'll all do better. And so I think that when you look at some of the tax rates in the 80s, it's true that cutting some of those very high marginal rates was beneficial, but we haven't had, compared to the rest of the globe, compared to most countries around the world, we do not have exceptionally high tax rates. You will find a couple of countries with lower tax rates that try and lure US businesses. Ireland a ways back was trying to do that pretty successfully, got a lot of the pharmaceuticals to go there, offering them a sweetheart deal. That's why every once in a while you'll hear the term repatriation of the money. But trickle down economics counts on the fact that the wealthiest and most powerful are going to be most concerned about you and I. I think you and I are most concerned about you and I, right? And so a healthy middle class, we do need corporations to be able to make a profit. Do we need Amazon to be tax-free? No, we don't. Are there, economic costs, road usage? Are there environmental costs to the Amazon model? There are. And should those things be factored in? They should. The idea of, when you hear Republicans often say fiscal conservative, is it's a capitalist-based economy, limited government, and laissez-faire economics, right? Government gets out of it. Well, we know that in theory, that makes sense. But in reality, we've seen the concentration of wealth to a few individuals, to a few companies who are not paying their fair share and yet use the roads, the bridges, everything else that we build.
Next question is, isn't military spending like the biggest expense in our budget?
Well, there is that, but usually that's not viewed, like some of the core spending of that isn't discretionary. So parts of it are, but parts of it are commitments that we've made. And it's true that as the US and Europe support Ukraine, right? The spending on that has gone up, and that's going to be one of the debates that we see in Congress. And I think that honest people could come to different conclusions about what we should be doing and how much we should be sending and whether or not we should be doing that. However, I think it's important to realize again, and so much of what I do is, we know what happened, but had we made different choices, where would we be? And so much of the lens that I look through the spending in Ukraine at is, if we go back to February, March of last year, the belief was that Putin was largely unstoppable, that there was a very high probability that he wouldn't stop at Ukraine and may roll into NATO countries because of our agreements with NATO, that we then would be drawn into the war, not only financially, but also boots on the ground. And so if we had the chance to stop that by helping the Ukrainians stand up themselves, the fiscal spending seems like, if we could go back and look at, some of the great wars in a different way, had we had a chance to stop it in its infancy rather than let it spread, what would we do to go back to that? So that's my personal view. Others could look at it differently. But if you do see it as a systemic threat to democracy worldwide, and it's fascinating to me that Sweden and Finland want to come into NATO now, because for so long they didn't. So, the neighbors obviously saw that as a threat. Then the pocketbook is a pretty easy way to defend ourselves. And I would also point out that one of the great things about being a government is you can print your own money. And that can go too far. But there are times when you need to spend. It's a lot like, if your parent is sick and needs medicine, well, I would put that on my credit card if I didn't have it, right? That's a value that I would do it. And there are moments when, as a country, we need to spend more than we currently take in. But we're a big economy and we're an adaptable economy. And so overspending in a finite period doesn't mean we have to do it forever. Right. And so that's the other part, that deficit spending for the US government is not quite the same thing as deficit spending for us as individuals. I like to draw the analogy because it helps us sort of relate to what it means. but government spending is in a different category.
Is there a reason we haven't tried to remove the cap on Social Security contributions? And would that be a viable fix for the program?
So I think what the question is asking is, right now there's a cap. If you earn over a certain amount, you only pay Social Security benefits up to that amount. Is that what the question is coming from?
Yeah, I think so. Like
Okay, so
lifting the cap, yeah.
if you earn $1 million, you only pay Social Security tax on the first part of that. I think it's a question of fairness. And again, I think this is an issue where honest people can disagree. There is also a cap on how much high earners will draw out. And so if Social Security is meant to benefit everybody who pays into it, then we get into looking at the cap. If Social Security is a wealth transfer program where we're going to cap the benefits that are drawn, but not cap the amount paid in, then that's okay. We could do that. But that's a conversation about fairness and how much should we pay in and what should it look like. And so there's not a financial reason you couldn't do it. But there may be a question of fairness on whether or not you should do it. I would personally prefer to see tax brackets go up rather than just the Social Security. But sure, that's one option that could be debated to help sustain Social Security.
Okay, next question. What's a good rebuttal when someone on the other side is going on and on about being fiscally conservative, but the people that they've elected to office like don't support Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security? Is there an argument for fiscal conservative to support those things, or?
Well, what I would say is fiscally conservative is fiscally responsible. So if we're changing the rules and we're saying nobody gets Social Security, nobody gets Medicare, say it. But if if they say they don't support it, what we find is when people draw it down, almost everybody supports it. There are very few people who don't go on to Medicare, who don't draw their Social Security benefit. And in fact, we're finding with Obamacare, there are a number of people who don't understand that some of the programs they're in and some of the protections they get are Obamacare. So I think what I would ask them, and it's tough because I will say that there are some people who just are not open to conversation. But to me, fiscally conservative means that in good times, you put some money away for a rainy day. So that would be under the Trump administration when the economy was expanding, we should have been paying down the deficit, not running it up. So that when inevitably, and Biden didn't create the pandemic, right? It's a global pandemic. So that inevitably, when challenges come, we as a country are in a strong place to respond. A strong economic foundation allows us to be a stronger country. And so if we cut taxes without also addressing spending, or if we, as Bush did, go to war, which many, I think we had to respond to 9/11. Others have different views, but in my opinion, but then we can't also cut taxes and we can't also expand benefits, right? We have to have a conversation with the American people. There's a speech with George Bush, you can go Google it, where he was asked after 9/11 what Americans could do, right? And there was a moment to really call us forward. We could have talked about clean energy, given that 19 of the 20 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, right? People wanted to do something. And his response was, go shopping. And I know why he said it. He said it because 70% of the economy is consumers. And the Republicans know it. And they know when things turn bad, the government has to step in. But if you take a look, we had zero deficit when Clinton left office, and it exploded under Bush. And then came the financial crisis, and it exploded even more because we were within a hair's distance from a Great Depression. Climb our way back out of that. Trump comes into office, right? The deficit also exploded under Obama because we were in a crisis. Started to come down because the economy was doing well. Along comes Trump, cuts taxes, the economy is growing, the deficit is growing. leaving us back on our heels for the next crisis. I mean, it's just so irresponsible. It's
Mhm.
if we ran our homes the way the Republicans run try to run the economy, and the economy is bigger than Washington. I will say, I am fairly optimistic because the economy is bigger than Washington, D.C. They can help or they can hurt, but the economy is bigger than what the policies are. And that's why we've been as resilient as we've been. But certainly when Washington can help, that is a good thing for all of us.
What will happen if Republicans will not increase the debt ceiling? I guess the question is, what if we get to the brink of a debt ceiling crisis? What's the impact on the economy, the world economy?
We don't know because we've never crossed it. So I will say that Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has already put into place some extreme measures to buy us time. So we're going to cross the debt ceiling in a week or two. And by stopping funding to certain retirement programs, et cetera, she's going to buy us some time. Not clear exactly how much, but probably out until late spring. But basically what we think would happen is if the US defaults, we've announced to the world that you cannot count on the United States and our bonds, which are the bedrock of many foreign countries' holdings, because the United States economy is viewed as the safest economy in the world. And we enjoy a lot of economic benefits because so much cash from overseas is held in US treasuries. And if we default, what we're really saying to the world is, hey, the crazies are in control. And if you want to be sure that your money is in a safe place, maybe you should put some money elsewhere.
That's not good.
And just one thing, we really don't know because it's never happened.
And we don't want it to happen. There's a reason that it's never happened. So
Don't want it to happen because, it's like telling your creditors, screw you, I'm not going to pay. And then you go back to them and say, hey, can I have a loan?
Yeah.
No, they're not going to.
I like how you break that down. That's very, very understandable. Like a lot of your analogies are very clear and concise. I appreciate that. Last question. Well, two more questions, but pretty quick. Is protecting the environment bad for the economy? It's a pretty broad question. That's your daughter asking, actually.
Is that you, Sophia, or Olivia?
It is.
No, protecting the economy can be very good for protecting the environment can be very good for the economy. It can be bad for specific industries, which have done tremendous damage to the environment. But if you take a look from an economic standpoint, what are the wildfires and mudslides in California costing us? What is the more extreme weather costing us? And if you really were to factor in the real costs that we all pay for the increased damage, disruption, rebuilding, et cetera, there are real economic costs to it. And so coming up with cleaner, better ways of doing things that allow the planet to heal and are more sustainable, it's good. I liken it to, I don't understand, again, the Republicans, when they're chanting, oil and coal. We don't stand at our doctor's office and say, bring the leeches, bring the leeches, bring the leeches. I want medical care from 200 years ago, right? We would never say it. We would never say, you know what, get rid of my cell phone. I want to go back to carrier pigeon. I am all for the carrier pigeons. And yet somehow, and I get why Texas is doing it because they have a vested interest, but somehow they have conned their voters into believing that oil, we need energy. We need energy. We don't have to have it be oil. Oil is undoubtedly going to be part of the solution, but who wants the leeches when you can have, nanosurgery, minimally invasive, and be home that night? Why are we insisting? Why are they insisting? Insisting that we use technology that is clearly finite, outdated, costs us environmentally and costs us militarily, because so much of, one of the first people to come out and say that climate change was a risk was the US military, because they're fighting these wars. They're seeing the disruption in people. They're having to drive tankers of oil across lands at slow speeds that are easy targets. They understand exactly what it is. So no, absolutely not. Now, we have to have smart policy, but no, we can have environmental care and economic growth.
Yep. 100%. Thank you. Plus, I think I would tell my daughter, you know what, we need to have environmental care. We're not even gonna have a planet. So, what's more important, right? All right. Well, last thing I'll throw out there, and you guys can crowdsource this in the chat as well. And economic resources you recommend people check out, things they could read to help, bone up on this information. Someone in the chat put Bo, I can't pronounce his name, Bo of the Fifth. Online. He does a lot of good videos about stuff like this, and I think about Ukraine. Do you have any other resources you'd recommend?
Oh, you know what? I read so much. I will say that if you can get a copy of it, the book is out of print. I've been searching for one, but the former international chair of Goldman Sachs wrote a book about how the US pays for its wars. And it was humbling to realize that we have gotten so far away that we ask 1 or 2% of the population to fight, and the other 98% of us are just worried about our target run. And certainly we can pull together as a country and do more. I also like to just scan the headlines from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. They've got some, just today, for example, they talked about, for the first time in China's history, they have a population decline. And that has all sorts of really fascinating implications about what comes next for China and the world. So I like to read all of those pieces.
Okay. That's it. Julie, you want to wrap up, say anything, last words here?
Well, I just want to thank Shereen for coming. Thank you for sharing, breaking these things down into tidbits that we can all understand and that we can use. So, I don't know, we might need to have you back again.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for all the great work everybody is doing. We rested. Now it's time to get back in there. So I appreciate it. Thank you all.
I second that. We want you back. So thank you so much. Everybody have a really good rest of your evening.